everybody. Today I have Ralph O'Brien, who is a global privacy and security advisor, and he resides in London. Thank you very much for joining, Ralph.
My pleasure.
I would like to talk about what privacy and security advisors do, and after that I would like to move on the biggest news of the maybe days.
Okay. In terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis, my role is essentially assisting companies to manage risk. I've spent the last 22 years now helping organizations from the very, very small to the very, very large, the very global organizations to understand information risk, really. And that's why I sort of dual with privacy and security, because you need to understand the legal elements of information risk, and which is almost more of an emerging field than security, really. Security has been perhaps a much better understood and much better managed part of sort of the dual area, because people see that as much more of a risk. But I think in the latter days, we're now starting to see privacy being put on an almost equal footing with security risk in terms of the wider information risk for an organization.
Okay. Also, we have this emerging issue, CJEU judgment. Can we talk about like Facebook and Schrems issue? What is your take on
Well, yeah, it's certainly the hot topic of the day. We've been expecting a judgment for quite some time. In fact, we had Advocate General's opinion way back when that this judgment is perhaps broadly in line with. The court's very rarely against it. So, as we all know, this is a gentleman called Maximilian Schrems. Max Schrems is an Austrian gentleman that's perhaps well known in the privacy industry for striking down the original, what we called safe harbor, the agreement between the EU and the US to allow data transfer.
Yes.
That was subsequently been replaced by something called Privacy Shield, which the US was giving additional safeguards to EU citizens in order to allow data transfer to happen easily between the EU and the US. However, there resides, shall we say, residual concerns on behalf of Schrems that things like national security exemptions, monitoring by the NSA, the revelations that Edward Snowden brought to the public consciousness about mass surveillance by US enforcement agencies, still exists even under the new replacement to Safe Harbor Privacy Shield. And what the court did essentially today was say that Privacy Shield is now no longer valid. The 5,500 organizations in the US that rely on that to transfer data from the EU to the US can no longer rely on Privacy Shield as a way to transfer data.
What will be consequences right now?
So they essentially will have to find another way of ensuring that data transfer is adequate. So organizations in the EU that transfer their data outside of the European Economic Area, outside of the EU member states, and by the way, come December, that will also include the UK due to Brexit.
Yes.
The UK will be a third country. The UK will be outside of the EU, outside of the European Economic Area, and therefore a sort of an untrusted area
Partner, yes.
as far as European data protection law is concerned. So anyone that was previously relying on Privacy Shield won't be able to do that. So they will have to find another transfer mechanism, and essentially there are a number. We can talk about the European Commission adequacy decisions that the US will probably never have. The other big consequence of the legal judgment was looking at what is called standard contract clauses. So standard contract clauses is where the EU has some pre-approved legal text that lawyers can put in a document, a contract that essentially says that the receiving business in the country outside of the EU will give them EU-like safeguards, EU-like rights,
Yes.
even though the law of the country might not normally give them that. So it's another
Okay.
way to prove that the law is equivalent. And what the court said about standard contract clauses was really interesting. The court said standard contract clauses will still be valid. They'll still be okay. You'll still be able to use them. However, what I thought was a really interesting caveat was it's down to the company agreeing those standard contract clauses to check that nothing in the receiving country's laws would invalidate that contract, would make the standard contract clauses not work, would not give the people their rights. And again, that becomes very interesting when we get to the US, because
They
if under Privacy Shield we've said that the surveillance laws are too bad for Privacy Shield to work, then does that mean for the standard contract clauses the laws are too bad for them to work as well?
how should we interpret it? Because isn't it hard to interpret?
Yeah, I think it is, and where the courts made a bit of a poor decision, in my view, perhaps a bit of a dodge, is that they kind of said, well, that's not our business to invalidate standard contract clauses. It's on a case by case basis for the national supervisory bodies to do that. So the DPC in Ireland, for example, the reason this went to the court in the first place is because the DPC in Ireland didn't want to deal with this. The DPC in Ireland, who is responsible for the transfers from Facebook in Facebook Europe to Facebook US, the DPC kind of said, "Whoa, too much of a problem for us. Let's send it to the European Court." And what the European Court essentially did is send it back. They said, standard contract clauses, it's your responsibility, national regulator, to decide whether these are valid or not on a case-by-case basis. So I think my question, therefore, is, does the national regulators have the desire? Does the national regulators have the resources to look at every contract that's ever been signed, the SCCs between EU data controllers and recipients outside of the EU, and sort of validate each one? Does even the controllers have the capability to look at those legal documents and validate if the national laws are adequate or not before they sign them? It's kind of a bit of a ridiculous situation, and it means that it's a bit of a dodge, and it remains to be seen how this is going to happen. Will companies now have to do some sort of legal assessments of the country they're sending them to, and will they be checked by the supervisory bodies? The sad thing is, resourcing wise, I suspect not.
Yeah, it is also, main challenge what I say, at every new rules and regulation, they are adding another layer of complexity instead of simplifying. And then we just say, okay, do whatever you want. We just really don't know. We just want to get the service. So now, as you already said, we don't have proper.
And that's the difficulty. That is the real difficulty. Organisations will do what organisations have got to do to earn their money and get the job done,
Yes.
And it's a bit kind of, whilst I agree that EU law is based on fundamental human rights, and we know that everywhere we go within the European Economic Area, we have our fundamental human rights protected, and therefore it's a valid question to say, if the data leaves that club, goes beyond that club, will other countries give our citizens and our people in the European Economic Area the same rights and freedoms? It's a valid question to ask.
Yes.
But essentially, businesses just want to get the job done, right?
Yes.
And I actually think the problem is not a legal one; it's more of a practical one. So I don't have a problem with standard contract clauses per se, apart from the fact that businesses just get the lawyers to sign them. Give me the document, I'll sign it, and we'll carry on working as before. What I would prefer, and this is from a much more practical perspective, is to see someone say, okay, forget about the contract. What's that resulted in? When I send data from the EU to the US, having a standard contract clause signed by a lawyer, that's just a tick in the box. But am I going to audit that? Am I going to look at that company and look at what they're doing with the data? And, rather than just say, oh, I've got the contract in place, let's move on, to actually start to look at the practical way they are processing the data. and
But what do
ask
you
if it
expect?
ensures the right
But
protections. Yeah.
but what do you expect? Most probably they are just going to look at the sign, but they are not going to look at what they are doing in practice.
And that's the sadness for me, and I've always had some suspicions around international transfers is that it's sometimes a little bit of a paperwork exercise for the lawyers, as opposed to something that presents a practical improvement to the rights and freedoms of the individual.
But what
And
would
I think
you
that's where the problem lies.
what
Yeah,
would you
that's where the problem
suggest
lies.
if you were at the board? What type of solution you would propose to them?
Well, I mean, I think I'd start by proposing a review. Most organisations should hopefully by now, because they're told to within laws like the GDPR, have a good idea about their data processing. So, number one, know your data processing. Map out your data flows, know where your data moves across the globe. Yeah, number one, and that's hard. That's actually quite difficult, more difficult than most people realise, because especially when you use like a third-party cloud provider, you've essentially got almost no idea once it disappears into that third-party cloud, right?
Yes.
All you can do is rely on the assurances given by the third-party cloud provider. Because the problem is we now live in a world with global businesses, but national laws. And those
Yeah.
national laws put up walls that global businesses don't like or want even to respect. In many cases, we've seen, the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, not show up to international committees when you've got 12, 16 countries sitting there saying, we demand accountability for the way you're treating our data. And, if company is bigger than country, that's an issue, right?
Yes.
And yeah, so practically, going back to your actual question, practically, we've then got that ability of a company to understand its data transfers, know its data, know where things are. And once you've identified the movements, it's then to select a suitable adequacy method and review the ones you're using. Yeah, if it's Privacy Shield, that's dead. We need to find an alternative. If it's SCCs, I would suggest performing some sort of assessment on those SCCs to ensure that you believe that the SCC and the practical result of that SCC provides the rights and the freedoms, because they're now subject to challenge by the supervisory authorities. Essentially, it's not just enough to say, great, we've got SCCs, they're pre-approved, we're good. It's now up to the supervisory authorities to begin to police whether they are good. So, and that's been a real change. So yeah, number one, know your data flows. Number two, provide a review of where data is leaving the EU, of what adequacy method you'll choose. And there are a number available that go beyond SC and Privacy Shield, probably beyond the scope of this call.
Yeah. Uh, it is also interesting to me that like European Union as an organization couldn't make a decision for the whole Europe. So how can we just let every individual country to make decision for each case by case? So it is really upsetting if they can.
Yeah, like I said, it's a bit of a dodge. I mean, I think the question that was in front of the court was about data transfers from EU to US for Facebook underneath SCCs and Privacy Shield.
Yeah.
Privacy Shield they've killed entirely. SCCs they've said, well, because it's not only transfers to the US, we can't say that SCCs are completely invalid. But what we can do is say that probably Facebook shouldn't be relying on them for the US data transfers, and it's up to the national supervisory bodies to do their job and start enforcing these, when we all know practically they're probably incapable of doing that. And you're right, that it's a difficult position. And I think, I don't think we're going to see national supervisory bodies turning around tomorrow and start sending out
No.
enforcement action on organisations. I think that there's some sympathy. The supervisory authorities are fairly practical. This is something organisations will have to deal with in the fullness of time. But I think there's much bigger systematic problems at the moment regarding, as I said, national law and global business, and the push and the pull between the barriers that local laws throw up compared to the barrierless society of the global internet user and the global internet business. And I think all organizations can do is manage their risk. All organizations can do is make sure the right security safeguards are in place. You give people the rights that they're afforded by law. You try and make sure that your suppliers and vendors moving down through the supply chain are doing the same. The only problem comes, and this is another perhaps a little failing of EU law, where you have, the EU law, especially in data protection law, talks about your company being this controller, the big bad organization who's responsible for everything. And therefore you have a contract with your processor, your smaller organization who does what you tell it to, who acts on your instruction.
Yes.
And that may have been the case 20 years ago. You were the big company telling your smaller outsourcer what to do. But when your processors are Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Salesforce, who are all massive companies, bigger than you are, who say, sign our contract, have it on our terms, but we're just the processor, by the way. We're just the processor,
balance also.
Yeah, and again, that's a real sort of power imbalance again between your local provider who is, I mean, don't get me wrong, you could do it yourself, you could set up your own cloud, you could set up your own IT infrastructure, but practically and economically these days, to be competitive in business, people will go with those third parties. And when we see, and again, looking at the news in the last 24 hours, organizations like Twitter, for example, having massive security hacks.
Yes.
The data breaches will only get bigger because what used to be sort of locally held in your filing cabinet in your local office, we consolidated the data on servers, and now we're consolidating the data again on someone else's servers who now holds everybody's data. And therefore the security breaches, when they occur at these larger providers, will be that much bigger.
Unexpected.
It's a huge amount of trust.
Yeah.
So the scale has changed. It's like comparing the capability of harm of a Homo sapiens picking up a stick to a Homo sapiens pressing the button on a nuclear weapon. As the technology advances, the capability for great harm increases, but equally you could argue so does the capability for great good. As we combine big data, as we try to fight pandemics, with track and trace solutions, as we get insights that can benefit the whole of the world. I don't think anyone can deny their mobile phone in their pocket can do much more than we ever envisaged that they ever could, and what great benefits that has brought us, but also what great risks. And that's the kind of the societal questions I think we need to ask ourselves. What's the trade-off? What's the payoff? And for businesses, what's the risk of X composed to what's the risk of Y, and make your own decisions and decide where you want to invest your resources. And for me, privacy and security are not just top of the agenda for your service user in terms of trust, but also top of your agenda for your service user in terms of more social responsibility. Not can we, but should we? Perhaps should be the question we ask. Almost forget about the law. And actually start thinking about ethically, should we?
Great. I would like to have these topics discussed in next series also. Thank you very much for joining, and I appreciate your insights, and thank you again.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure.